It's time to talk about joints. We're not going to talk about this kind of joint. That's a constant velocity joint. Those are on automobiles and trucks. I fixed the constant velocity joint on my Volkswagen bus at 3 o'clock in the morning in January in a parking lot in Elko, Nevada. It was 8 degrees outside. My wife kept yelling at me from outside the window of the van, "Are you done yet?" And we're not going to talk about this kind of joint either. Reefer madness. Women cry for it, men die for it. This is a movie. It was a propaganda movie made back in the 1930s. They were afraid marijuana was going to be the next heroin. So they actually put out movies of just falsehoods. Now, I'm not saying marijuana is good or bad, but this was just clearly false stuff. It was designed to scare people. Drug crazed abandon. What actually happens? They still show this on late night cable, so watch for it. It's hilarious. It's really hilarious. And there were a bunch of other movies too. Devil's Harvest, and I can't remember. They were all propaganda movies. We're going to talk about this kind of joint. You should recognize that joint. We've got the femur coming together with the tibia. You can see the condyles there of both bones. You can see the articular cartilage coating the ends of the bone. What we haven't seen before, just looking at the bones, are all of the ligaments, all of the things tying everything together. And that's what we're going to look at now. That's what makes joints. It's where bones come together. No longer just individual bones, now bones coming together. So joints, technically known as arthroses or articulations, and you've seen that word before. What happens when you get inflammation of a joint? Remember, inflammation is itis. So what's inflammation of an arthrosis? That's arthritis. Now you know why it has that name. Joints hold the skeleton together, all right, so otherwise the bones would be constantly coming apart. And they give the skeleton mobility, all right. Joints hold things so that we can move and come back to where we started from and so on. Ligaments and tendons help to stabilize the joints. And there's a big difference between them. Make sure you get it straight now. Ligaments connect bone to bone. The root word liga means to tie, like a ligature, something that ties things together. Women get a tubal ligation when they don't want to have babies anymore. So a ligament means something that ties things, and in this case we're tying bones to bones. Tendons, on the other hand, connect muscle to bone, and as we'll see coming up, a tendon is actually part of the muscle itself, so that shouldn't be hard to remember. Tendons are actually muscle tissue. They connect the muscle to the bone. Whereas ligaments don't have anything to do with muscles. They simply are strings, basically, that tie bones together. Okay? Just take a look for a moment at these joints right here. The joint in the lower left, do you see what joint that is? Yeah, that's the shoulder joint. You should be able to recognize the parts of it. We see the head of the humerus. We see the coracoid process of the scapula. We see the acromion of the scapula. We see the clavicle. Those are all bones. And look at, see, the bones are all tied together. And those are, what would those be, tying those bones together? Tying the acromion to the coracoid process, that would be a ligament. And then we see a big muscle like pectoralis major, your chest muscle, and it's attaching to the head of the humerus. So what kind of stuff is that attaching it? That would be a tendon. See the difference? Tendons are part of the muscle. They connect the muscle to the bone. Whereas ligaments don't have any connection to the muscle. They simply tie the bones together. And in the upper right, you see the ankle joint. See all those ligaments that hold the talus? That's one of the tarsal bones. That forms your ankle joint. To the tibia. I tore through every one of those ligaments playing softball back in the 1980s. It took me 14 months before I could walk normally again. As I'll mention several times, broken bones are much better than torn ligaments. Broken bones heal in 6 weeks. Torn ligaments take months. In my case, a severe ligament tear took over a year for it to heal, before I could walk again without a limp. Joint structure determines the direction and distance of movement, which is what we call the range of motion. That's an important term to know. Some joints have a huge range of motion, others have a very limited range of motion. So, can you think of a joint that has a huge range of motion? Yeah, the shoulder joint. Think of all the ways your shoulder can move. Whereas other joints have very limited, and we'll see some of those limited function joints. You probably don't even know they're joints yet. We'll see those coming up. Now, Here's something that was almost always true. Joint strength decreases as mobility increases. Stop and think about that for a moment. I want you to be able to think through these things and figure them out. What does that mean? If we have a really, really strong joint, how movable is it? Joint strength decreases as mobility increases and vice versa. So really strong joints are not very movable, whereas joints that are highly movable are not nearly as strong. So what's the most commonly dislocated joint in the human body? Yeah, the shoulder joint. The same one that has the greatest range of motion is also the one that's most likely to come apart. So we can talk about the structural and the functional classifications of joints. Does that distinction sound familiar? Structural versus functional? Yeah, that's anatomy and physiology. So when we talk about structural classifications, we're talking about the anatomy of a joint. We're talking about how it's made. When we talk about the functional classification, we're talking about the physiology of the joint, which is how it moves. So let's look at, there are three different structural classifications. Some joints we call fibrous joints. They're held together by fibrous connective tissue. Cartilaginous joints are held together by cartilage. Duh! What's big and red and eats rocks? What happens when you drop a white hat in the Red Sea? It gets wet. So what holds cartilaginous joints together? Yeah, cartilage. And then synovial joints. This is a very special category. They have what's called a synovial cavity, and they usually have lots of accessory ligaments. Synovial joints are the most common joints in your appendages, in your arms and legs. So your shoulder joint, your elbow, your hip, your knee, your fingers, your toes, those are all synovial joints. They're the most common by far. They're also the most movable. But right now we're just looking at structure. Those are the three types of structure: fibrous, cartilaginous, and synovial. Now let's look at functional. As I say, they're most of the joints in the appendages. So functional, a synarthrosis. I'm sorry, it's not my fault. I didn't make that word up. It was invented before I was born. I had to learn it, and now you have to learn it as well. There's nothing I can do about this. Synarthrosis means an immovable joint. You're going, wait, immovable? I thought joints move. Well, not this kind, and we'll see coming up. You've seen these joints before. You just may not have known they were joints. So a synarthrosis is immovable. Amphiarthrosis is slightly movable, just like those people who went to Amphi High. They're all slightly movable. So amphiarthrosis means a slightly movable joint, whereas a diarthrosis means a freely movable joint. Moves very freely. So what's going to happen here is we're going to be able to classify joints by both the structure and the function. So every joint that we can name will have both a structural classification and a functional classification, and I expect you to know both. Let's begin by looking at some fibrous joints. So remember, what does that mean? These are all joints that are held together by fibrous connective tissue. First one is a suture, and we've seen those before, didn't we? We saw the four sutures: the coronal, the lambdoid, the sagittal, and you remember the other one? The squamous. So those were holding bones of the skull together. Those are immovable. You don't want the bones of your skull to be moving around. That'd be very weird. So sutures are actually joints, because a joint is where two bones come together. But this is an immovable joint. So let's say I asked you, what is the complete classification of a suture? I want both the structural and the functional classification. So first of all, what is the structural classification of a suture? Look in the upper left of the side. It's a fibrous joint. So a suture classified structurally is a fibrous joint. Now let's classify it functionally. What is it? It's a synarthrosis. Okay? So it's an immovable joint. This is only between the bones of the skull. All right? So that's the only place you find sutures. When the bones in the suture become completely fused, they now call it a synostosis. The root word os means bone. So in a child, the sutures are still a lot of just fibrous connective tissue. As you grow older, they ossify and become completely bone. So suture becomes a synostosis. Synostoses also occur at the epiphyseal lines of long bones. So remember, the epiphyseal plate was cartilage, Once it ossifies and turns to bone, we call it the epiphyseal line. That's now a synostosis as well. Synostosis is where a suture, or where the fibrous joint turns into a bone joint. It's completely bone. A syndesmosis, once again, it's not my fault. Syndesmosis, so what is the complete classification of a syndesmosis? It's a fibrous amphiarthrosis. So what does that mean? It's made of fibrous connective tissue and it's slightly movable. Okay? See how easy this is? Examples would be the interosseous membrane between the tibia and the fibula, also between the radius and the ulna. So why do we do that? Why do we have a partly movable joint? Well, we don't want it to be completely movable because we don't want your radius and your ulna to be coming apart all the time. We want them to maintain the same distance between each other. But we also have to pronate and supinate. We have to be able to turn our hand palm down and palm up. What's happening when we do that is that the radius is rotating around the ulna. The interosseous membrane allows that movement to take place. I had a student in my class a while ago who had a radio-ulnar synostosis. What would that mean? That meant that his radius and his ulna were fused together as solid bone. That meant that he couldn't turn his forearm palm down and palm up. He had to move his whole shoulder to get that to happen. And he said it really didn't bother him because that's the way he was born, so he never knew any other way. To him, it was kind of weird that other people didn't have to do that. And then finally, a gomphosis. This is yet again a synarthrosis that is made of fibrous connective tissue. Where do we find gomphoses? In the alveolar processes that hold your teeth in place. There is a periodontal ligament that holds the tooth into the alveolar socket. And as you may know, that's periodontal disease. If you don't brush your teeth and floss, bacteria get in and start eating away that ligament. And so a gomphosis, again, is a fibrous synarthrosis. It's made of fibrous connective tissue, and it doesn't move. It's a synarthrosis, okay? So those are the three kinds of fibrous joints. Let's then look at the next structural category. And what was that? What was the next structural category? Cartilaginous joints. Let's take a look. Cartilaginous joints, first one to look at is a synchondrosis. So here's, again, I've mentioned this before, C-H-O-N-D-R, chondra, always means cartilage. So a synchondrosis, it's so easy to remember. It's a synarthrosis, it doesn't move, and it's made of cartilage, chondro, cartilage. Where do we find these? It's hyaline cartilage, all right. The epiphyseal plate. So look at the illustration in the upper left. We see there in the head of the femur, we see the epiphysis, we see the two epiphyseal plates made of cartilage. Because there's bone on each side, that's technically a joint. It's where two chunks of bone are being held together. So it's a cartilaginous joint. And of course it doesn't move because we don't want the ends of your femur to be moving around. You're growing from there. We want that to stay stable and in place. So a synchondrosis is a cartilaginous synarthrosis. It's made of cartilage. It doesn't move. That's where you grow from. Also between the first rib and the manubrium, that's a synchondrosis. And when the epiphyseal plate closes, as I mentioned before, it becomes the epiphyseal line. Now it is a synostosis. The cartilage has turned to bone. Os instead of chondra. Bone instead of cartilage. Another place we see this is a symphysis, which is an amphiarthrosis. What is it structurally? It's made of cartilage. It's a cartilaginous joint. What is it functionally? It's an amphiarthrosis. It's slightly movable. So it's where the ends of the bones are covered with hyaline cartilage with a big chunk of fibrocartilage in between. Fibrocartilage, remember, is the toughest cartilage. It's a big shock absorber. And so where do we see this? The pubic symphysis is an example. You can see the diagram there in the lower right. That's a big chunk of fibrocartilage that holds the two pubic bones together. Why do we want it to be slightly movable? Because that's where the head of the little parasite has to come through. Also, like when you're running and jumping, you want there to be a little bit of give in your hip, in your pelvis. Otherwise, you'd be breaking your pelvis all the time. So that allows for just a slight bit of movement to give some flexibility to the joint. Also, the manubrium and the body of the sternum. So when you do something like swing a baseball bat, a lot of force is generated there. You want there to be a little bit of flexibility, and that's what happens. Okay, so we're now on to the most important joint of all, the one we're going to spend the most time on, a synovial joint. Remember, so structurally, that's its classification. A synovial joint is a structural classification. Now, what is it functionally? It's a diarthrosis. That means freely movable. So synovial joints are freely movable joints. All right, structurally, we call them synovial joints. Functionally, they are diarthroses. They are the most common joints in the body, and they all have an articular or joint capsule. That's a distinguishing feature. It has an outer fibrous capsule, which is very tough, helps protect against when you get drunk and bump into things. You got that tough outer fibrous layer. But inside is a synovial membrane, and that's it's a lubricated, smooth membrane that prevents friction as the bones move around. And then likewise over the ends of the bones we see articular cartilage. So in the upper left you see what kind of joint is that? That's an interphalangeal joint between two of your phalanges. So notice how there's that blue line covering the end of both bones. That's the articular cartilage. And then notice the joint capsule has a double layer. The outer fibrous layer is the tough stuff that protects you, and then inside you have that synovial membrane. The synovial membrane is in green, see it there? So that's a slippery, lubricated membrane in order to give some, prevent friction in the joint. And so the other thing about the synovial joints is they all have synovial fluid. What's synovial fluid? Well, I say it's kind of like nature's WD-40. So the synovial capsule, the joint capsule, is filled with WD-40. Why? To reduce friction, to make smooth movement of the joint, all right? So synovial fluid, nature's WD-40. It lubricates. It also has the nutrients that the joint needs, all right? So serves several functions here. By the way, WD-40, anybody know where that name comes from? WD-40? It's water dryer or water displacer. I can never remember. But its big function was to make water go away. Water causes rust, so you spray WD-40 around moving parts and it'll displace the water. And then why is it 40? It was their 40th try. There was actually WD-1, WD-2, WD-3. When they finally got to 40, they said, "We're good. We got it. That's it. Package it. Sell it. We're done." So that's it. You can go to WD-40.com and learn more than you ever wanted to know about WD-40. It's actually fascinating. If you ever want to waste like an hour, go to WD-40.com. Get ready. Make some popcorn and have fun. Like I say, also supplies nutrients. And then a lot of synovial joints, not all, but at least some of the very big ones, have discs or menisci. So singular is meniscus, plural is menisci. So what's their purpose? They're big giant shock absorbers made of fibrocartilage. So where do you find them? You find them in places like your knee. You find them in between your vertebrae. So when you jump up and down, instead of bone cracking and clashing against bone, you've got these big thick pads of fibrocartilage. And sometimes you hear about how athletes have a torn cartilage. That's usually what they're talking about. It's the fibrocartilage in a synovial joint. They are shock absorbers, just like I was saying. And that's when you hear about the athletes having torn cartilage. That's usually what they mean. Now, synovial joints, again, structurally synovial joint, functionally diarthroses. They often have accessory ligaments. And they have both what are called intracapsular and extracapsular. So remember, a defining feature of a synovial joint was it had a joint capsule. Where do you suppose you find the intracapsular ligament? Yeah, what's big and red and eats rocks? A big red rock eater. Why don't you see a hippopotamus hiding in the trees? Because they're really good at it. So where do you find intracapsular joints? Inside the capsule. And where do you find extracapsular? Outside the capsule. Easy peasy, right? Then there are often bursae. That's plural. Singular is bursa, plural bursae. These are little sacs filled with what's essentially synovial fluid. So look in the diagrams on the left and on the right. On the right, see those little blue blobs? Those are bursae. Again, each one individually say bursa. They act kind of like ball bearings. If you're familiar with mechanical joints, they're ball bearings. Ball bearings produce very smooth, uniform movement, so you don't have jerky movement. Also, protection again. It protects bones and it protects connective tissue from scraping against one another. Inflammation of the bursae is known as bursitis. Now, see that word? It's nothing complicated to it. Itis, inflammation, bursa. Inflammation of the bursa is bursitis. And then notice also there what are called tendon sheaths. Tendon sheaths is a special elongated bursa. So look in the upper left. See how that tendon of the biceps brachii muscle is surrounded by a bursa it's wrapped around the tendon, but it's a long bursa that covers way up into the joint itself? Yeah, that's a tendon sheath. So that's all it is. It's just a sac of synovial-like fluid that surrounds the tendon to try to reduce friction. Of course, that can still happen. And what do we call it when that happens? If you get inflammation of your tendon sheath, that's tendinitis. So notice tendinitis is just a special type of bursitis. So hopefully those words aren't mysterious anymore, and now you know exactly what they mean. So we'll come back and pick up more about the joints in the next annotated PowerPoint.